So I think this is a really interesting comment, but I do think there's a couple of things that have to be considered with why the Holy Nation and the Cannibals are considered the only two factions that can logistically project their armies, properly. You see, a big part of it is they are two factions that have been around longer than most other factions on the face of Kenshi. Both of them are roughly 1,000 years old, and they may be even older because all we know for certain is they were around during the Second Empire, but we don't know exactly when during that timeline they came about, and we don't actually know how long the Second Empire, ran for. And they are the only factions that we know of that were able to successfully fend off in some capacity the Second Empire during what was considerably their peak. The Cannibals were basically an immovable threat that the Second Empire couldn't actually deal with, so they took up a purely defensive position in the north. And the Second Empire, at the time being the Cult of Stove, actually managed to successfully excise themselves and leave the Second Empire, despite, being completely downtrodden, oppressed, and frankly, attacked. And the early foundations of the Holy Nation seemingly came about during the end years of the Second Empire, so both of them were able to successfully repel and fight the Second Empire, which is something that no other faction can really say. I will say that saying the Cannibals are able to direct their armies is a little bit disingenuous because they don't really have a unified army or anything like that. They're kind of like independent tribes that all, have a unifying leader in the form of the Cannibal Grand Wizard and maybe the Meat Lord. I guess an accurate comparison for them would be like the Grounders from the 100, if that's a reference that anybody else understands. But I think that's a really good one in the idea that they're all individual tribes, but then they have the commander who kind of stands at the top where, the tribes may go to war with each other, but the commander is still kind of like an overseer of all of the tribes. It's a very, simplistic design, but it's kind of reminiscent of that. But back to the main point, the reason why the Holy Nation and the Cannibals tend to be more successful than other factions in terms of taking things is because the truth is they've been around longer and they've been doing it for longer. Although historically speaking, I guess the Holy Nation taking things is a relatively new thing. They were pretty much isolationists up until the most recent Phoenix, who is kind of a militaristic jagoff, and he's the one that's been really perpetuating a lot of the hate and the outward aggression towards the other factions of Kenshi that may have existed internally in the Holy Nation prior to this Phoenix, but wasn't really an outward threat until recently. The zealotness of the Holy Nation wasn't really an issue until recently, so...